now. And starting now on this one as well. Okay, all of our bases are covered. So good afternoon, virtual world. It is Shelby Hauer and Dr. Cris Hochwender here today, re-recording our week 2 session, and I'm really excited about it. We're gonna go more in depth than we even did last time, and I like the unbridled Cris Hochwender, so that's what we're gonna get today, and I'm very, very excited about it. So I will be skipping some of the general logistics since we don't have any live participants today, but I will do a quick plug for Warwick County Soil and Water Conservation District, which is who is hosting it. That's who I work for. I am the district technician for Warwick SWCD. And we are having a native plant sale in December, which sounds very strange, and I understand that. It seems even strange to have a native plant workshop in December. And the reason we're doing this is because these plants that you order are being planted by seed in a greenhouse. And so not only will it give you guys a cheaper plant to purchase, but these are customized orders being grown from the little babies that they are right now. And so it helps with the cost. And then this is all being done in a greenhouse in Knox County. Will Drews with the Knox County Soil and Water Conservation District is the one that is growing these and helping other counties actually have native plant sales similar to this one. So that's why we're having it now, is that you order them at the end, or deadline is mid-January, January 15th, and then they will get planted once you order them. And then the pickup date of these plants will be later in May, so we have to let them grow first. So that's why we're having it this time of year. And with that, we kind of wanted to add a native plant workshop to help you guys figure out maybe what you want to plant, what your goals are for your property. Maybe it's aesthetics, maybe it's maintenance and making things easier for yourself, or maybe it's just you don't know what attracts what. And so that's what this workshop is here for, to give you a more solid foundation of native plants and why they're important, and how you can enjoy them in your own backyard. So that is our plug for our native plant sale. You can contact me. My information is in the flyer. The order forms are on our website, warwickswcd.com. And you can find the order forms there, and also a short little catalog describing some of the native plants that we do offer. So I'm going to skip all of this fun stuff because I think Cris and I get the gist of it all. And I'm going to give a little introduction for our wonderful speaker today.
The shorter the better, right, Shelby?
What's that?
The shorter the better.
The shorter the see, you know, you give me a bio and I don't even get to read it. But all of this to say, Dr. Hochwender, he works for the University of Evansville. He has been there. Gosh, how many years have you been there, Cris?
20 years.
20 years. So that's almost that's almost my age.
It is. It's so close.
I know. That's I don't know if that's sad on your part or my part, either way. But he has extensive experience not only in the educational field, but in the field of research and with native plants and the evolutionary relationships that tie along with the ecosystem and the ecology of it all for native plants. And so I was confident to know and say and ask Dr. Hochwender to speak on native plants and why they are so important in some of those interesting relationships that they have. So I will leave it at that. He will do the rest. And because this is not a live version, I will be asking my own personal questions. And if you do ever have any questions, I'm sure Cris will give or leave his contact information at the end of it. So if anybody is interested further in his work or his brain, you can pick it later on too. So I will stop sharing now. And oh, look, it's already there. Perfect.
Shelby, thank you for that lovely introduction. Okay. And you're 100% on to say that it's through the evolutionary ecology of plants and they're herbivores that drives me into this interest in native plants. And so much of what I'll talk about today will connect with how herbivores are so closely connected with the plants that they feed on, and how the diversity of plants lends itself to have diversity of herbivores, including all the butterflies that we love, but also the pollinators, because you've demanded that of me as well. Clearly not my greatest strength, but a place that I'm really excited to start exploring. Oops, I just realized I have a different button that I have to do. So it's right there. And I also need to move this to a different place. Okay, much better. This is sort of an overview of what we'll be talking about today. The major theme that I'll talk about is sustaining biodiversity. Hopefully all of these things are already aspects of what you would be thinking about: the value of biodiversity, the causes for it, and some actions that can be taken to maintain diversity. And in fact, because Megan Ritterskamp, did I say her name correctly there? Gave such a great talk a week ago, or maybe a week and a half now. Many of these things are already covered. And some of the highlighted things that I'll be hitting on to, Megan also covered. Things like habitat destruction, but especially because of her skill and training, she really did a wonderful job talking about invasive species. I'll be adding some ecological concepts and arguments about foundation species, and some ways that plants are diversity enhancers and also magnet species. So we'll get to see that. And then, of course, the place that I love, the idea of chemical ecology, that is plants and their chemistry, and how that leads to some kinds of really interesting evolutionary arms race, but more specifically, how it lends itself to having greater insect diversity, especially butterfly diversity, because of the chemical ecology of plants. And we'll also do a little bit on pollination syndromes. Now, I'll be talking about these ideas, first scaling from a really large scale with Vectren Conservation Park. For me, it's a large scale. For some of the people who manage land, probably they're thinking 1,100 acres isn't a big deal. For me, it's a very big deal. But because of where I think my interest is and where a lot of our audience interest is, I think talking about the native plant garden here at the University of Evansville in the courtyard of Cook Center will be something that we're more excited about, because that's the way we can move into bringing it into your backyard and working at that scale. So thinking about the value of what these habitats are and what the diversity that's occurring in these ecosystems are. And again, Megan has pointed most of this out in much more detail than I will. But if we think about the value of ecological systems, we can really think about what is a core argument for why we need to protect them. Flood and erosion control is one of those critical services that we gain. We get protection because we have forests functioning, prairies functioning. Those help to capture water during rainy seasons and hold it and move it into the groundwater, which then lends itself to water purification. But it also prevents soils from being lost into our rivers. For forests especially, but also for really healthy prairie kinds of systems, those also function to capture a lot of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and through that store carbon in a place that isn't causing global warming. Of course, in addition, there are ways that animals are playing an important role, specifically specifically the way pollinators and bee pollinators, most importantly, are providing pollination for crops, not things like grasses, which are mostly going to be wind pollinated, but for all of those crops like tomatoes or blueberries, or in our region, probably watermelons. So wild pollinators, as well as the non-native honeybees, which would drive some of that. But all of that pollination is an ecosystem service, a benefit humans get from functioning ecosystems. But if we think of plant diversity in particular, as you get greater plant diversity, you get greater ecosystem services. And it's a pretty simple understanding of why that would be true. As you have greater diversity, what happens is no matter what instability might happen in the environment, there are species that are going to be able to respond effectively in that challenging environment. So while some might dial back in their success and their performance, other species perform more greatly. And so you have, in a more complex, diverse system, better ecosystem services occurring. In addition, greater plant diversity also leads to greater animal diversity. And the two things that we'll be looking at are herbivores and pollinators, but both of those also act as food resources for many predators, whether those are at the spider level or at the bird level or whatever kind of predator you might be more interested in. So this is just a slide to help remind us of why we might focus on plants, but also how insects and birds can matter. If we look across all the species that are threatened and endangered, that is, that are put on lists by the US government, flowering plants are the species that have the greatest number of endangered species, with roughly half of them being flowering plants, as well as threatened species. Birds also have a pretty large number of at-risk in one way or the other. And insects are just not loved. And so those numbers are very low. It's not that there aren't a lot of insect species and populations that have declined and are at risk. It's just we usually attend to plants and birds much more readily than we do to insects. But we recently did have another important bee pollinator that was just put on this list as well. If we think about the causes, and I'll be very brief here, the two core concerns have to do with habitat destruction or modification, which of course directly causes species to be lost, or alteration of habitat, which leads to greater flooding problems and more challenges as well. And one that backyard hobbyists perhaps have the greatest responsibility for, and that is non-native species, the introduction of plants that you might be attracted to putting in your backyard that then escape and become these aggressive non-natives or invasive species. And this is, I did want to give just a little bit of ecological and evolutionary context to that. When we bring in plants from another continent, often those plants are not coming with the burden of their herbivores or their natural enemies, the diseases that might be carried with them. And so they become free from that burden. And by being not eaten and not damaged by rusts or other fungi, they then are much more competitive in this new context. And in addition, there is not sort of that context of competition being experienced through evolutionary time by the plant species. And so in some cases, they become great competitors, pushing out the native species in those areas. Well, if we think about Indiana, and why wouldn't we think about Indiana? Here we are in the bottom corner of Indiana. the kinds of habitats we would want to think about are, of course, temperate deciduous forests. If we look at this map, almost all of the areas are temperate deciduous forest in one way or in another. You can also see this example with these ovals to represent places that have fairly high concentration of prairie habitat. Given that prairies are have less than 1% remaining nationally, these are a really vital kind of place to try to protect, or a vital kind of place to restore. Wetlands as well have been really drastically reduced as we've started to do habitat transformation, whether it's for cities and urban sprawl or for agricultural reasons. And so wetlands are also another place to focus. So if we're thinking about restoration in Indiana specifically, forests, things surrounding the Wabash River, and prairies would all matter. And I mentioned the Wabash River because it is Indiana's river. You can see in this picture all of the drainage that's associated with the Wabash River. And while there are small bits of it in Illinois and in Ohio, primarily this is covering the entire state of Indiana. And where it's not covering is actually down where we are here in Bandy and Warwick County, but that's because those rivers are dumping into the Ohio where the Wabash is also putting it. Well, the place that I'm going to talk about first is Vectren Conservation Park. And this is a property that's 1,100 acres. You can see it represented as this land mass that is really just this little spot right here. And by little, I mean, again, 1,100 acres. And this is visually, oh, hello, let's go back there. This is visually what that property looked like when we received it. Old field, old abandoned farmland that had had a lot of flooding bring in whatever was upstream from it. So as a brief history, this property was about 800 acres of farming area and then riparian forest in those places on the outside of the farmer's levee. It's been an agricultural land since the 1800s, and it was abandoned in 2001 when Vectren purchased the property, and then 6 years later gave it to UE, leased it to UE for nearly no expense for us to be able to do educational and restoration work on. Given that there were 6 years between ag use and when we started to work in it, some challenges exist there. And by some, I mean challenges that we don't have to face in our backyard. And so really part of the reason I'm talking about this is to highlight some challenges that you won't have to face in your backyard. With 1,100 acres right on a river, that means that it is flooded seasonally many years. And when it's not flooded, it's usually dealing with drought challenges. Both of those things favor this very aggressive, invasive species, Johnson grass. Now, while it's a very attractive looking grass as you drive by the roadside at 60 miles an hour, it really was introduced not by people doing horticulture, but by misinformed managers of land who encouraged people to put it out as a grass for grazing. And once that happened, it was released along rivers and streams, and the seed washed into all of the places that it could through flooding. I remember being down in New Orleans after the hurricane there, and all of the 9th district was covered in Johnson grass. Well, not surprisingly, all of the land in this area is also covered with Johnson grass that spread in there. So flooding and Johnson grass make this property a challenge. And I wanted to highlight VCP for another reason too. The first thing we did when we started doing research here was to take a survey of what actually was happening on this abandoned land. What kinds of species were occurring here? And as a part of that, I want to highlight this idea that Paul Rothrock developed. Well, he didn't develop it, but he did a phenomenal job of listing what the value of every species we find in Indiana is with regard to conservatism. And this is really a signal of how high of a quality is each species, or how likely would you find this species in unaltered land, but not in other areas. So a 0 would be given to a plant that could be found just anywhere and also invasive. So a 0 means that it's a problematic species that's not worthwhile. A 1 would be an extremely weedy species, but native. 2s and 3s also, not really a high water mark for desirability, because we don't have to worry about their success. They're really weedy native species. But something at a 10 would be those plants that typically would only be found in a place that was undisturbed. And so these are rarer valuable species that we might want to target for working with restoration, because they're being challenged with habitat destruction and the challenge of invasive species. So if we think about taking every plant at the site and using Rothrock's evaluation of ranking, on average, VCP's site has a value of 2. In other words, the property by itself is extraordinarily weedy and of low quality. And in addition, if you were to consider how many species there are, 136 species, with only 93 native species and 31 non-natives. So a quarter of that 1,100 acres are non-natives. And Johnson grass is one of the dominant species in the old fields. So if you did it on a proportion scale, it's even worse than that. So to think about restoration on this property, we were really looking both at forests and their understory. And so in those areas, we actually saw much better quality with more native species and less invasives occurring. And you can see that roughly 70 species, some of those are shared in the Forbes species in the prairie and meadow areas that we looked at. But 12 species of grasses in the prairies and meadows, and about 40 species of herbaceous perennials that are not grasses. The way we evaluated these species for nativeness had to do with Deems flora of Indiana and a confirmation of them occurring either in Gibson County, where the property is, or in the surrounding counties, right? So if you think about Deem, this phenomenal naturalist who spent so much of his time just going out and cataloging every species in Indiana, but not just in Indiana, but which counties he found them in. Phenomenal talent to be able to do that. And he was doing this back in the 30s and 40s, which makes it even better for us now because there was still much more naturally occurring habitat. And so this is sort of a confirmation of what would be occurring here in Indiana. Now, Deem wasn't really a lover of Vandenberg County. So you'll see a lot of dots all around Vandenberg County, but that does suggest then that those plants would also be occurring in this area. And if you want details of VCP and what plants were found at the site, you can look for an Indiana Academy of Science publication that several students and I worked on and published not quite a decade ago. So, but here's the quick list. Some of the common trees, of course, involve silver maple and eastern cottonwood. because those are river species, right? They enjoy those floodwaters. They like getting their feet wet. And Shelby, who spent some time at Wesselman Woods Nature Preserve, would tell you that southern hackberry or sugar hackberry also likes getting its feet wet. And sugarberry, though, hasn't really been that successful in disturbed places. And so this has a high C value, right? A value of 7 is a pretty good one. In addition, Vectren, before they gave us that long-term lease on the property, also invested in planting a lot of native trees. Unfortunately, one of them, because of what was available, were sycamores, which, you know, are going to blow in and colonize that area anyway. But the sweet gums are a great addition. And here you can see that sweet gum leaf. And the bur oaks are also a terrific addition. And I'll talk a bit about why oaks and the cottonwood bolded above are really good additions to the property. We also started to plant some other tree species, including tulip poplar, if for no other reason that it's a state tree, sassafras, because who wouldn't want to grow sassafras, and oaks that are adapted to the wetlands. And this springboards us into one of those topics I'd like to talk about, foundation species. So foundation species are plant species that provide a structure for the rest of the community that starts to colonize and utilize that species. And typically they're going to provide this stable habitat that allows those animal species to utilize it. And cottonwood is a great example of a foundation species. And so the list of 4 things down below here is actually from Whittam, who did this research out in the West, but in the same way his results are representative of the Western cottonwood, the same things are likely true for the Eastern cottonwood. So if you think about genotypes, and what we mean in plants typically for genotypes is seeds from different mothers. And if we compare those genotypes that could differ, they can differ in chemistry. And that chemistry means that the herbivores that colonize and use those genotypes might be different suites of herbivores. And that diversity of herbivores that use different genotypes then can alter which birds and the number of birds that are going to be using those trees. And so you can get this magnifying upward effect of a given genotype impacting the herbivore community and in turn impacting those predators. And his research actually found some really amazing other things along the lines of, as you change the chemistry of the leaves, that changes the rate at which those leaves break down. And so it changes the rate of carbon cycling and nitrogen cycling. So that means that the ecosystem function changes depending on these foundation species. Not only that, but then we can bring beaver in, because who wouldn't want to talk about beaver? Beaver are often thought of as ecosystem engineers. In other words, they change the environment that they're in. And by engineering dams, which Shelby could probably express the word dam in a different way, but beavers, when they're damming, cause these landscape changes where forests get converted into wet meadows that slowly move back into forests. And so those dynamics really allow for greater diversity to happen on a large landscape and multi-ecosystem level. And so the thing that differs in cottonwood genotypes actually cascades up into beaver behavior, which cascades up into river dynamic changes that happen as well. So by changing the genotypes of species, you can have ripple effects that are going to large scale ecosystem changes as well. So foundation species, a really interesting thing to consider when you're thinking about what kinds of plants you might want in your own backyard. Diversity enhancers is probably the biggest thing you want to think about when you're thinking about plants in your backyard. Diversity enhancers are those species that when you use them, invite a payload more species with them. So when we're thinking about trees, in this case, the cottonwood that I just gave as an example, that genus has over 350 species of herbivores that use it. So if you have a cottonwood in your backyard, you don't have one plant. You have hundreds of species potentially utilizing that. Now, the biggest diversity enhancer that we could turn toward would be oaks. If we just think about moth and butterfly species and not all the other kinds of herbivores that use oaks, we're talking more than 500 species that use the genus Quercus. So it's an extraordinary diversity enhancer. And of course, I also have to bring up willows because it's a place I've been doing research. And the same thing that we talked about for cottonwoods as a foundation species is certainly true for willows based on my own studies, but also they're really important diversity enhancers. And for all of these cases, much of that has to do with the chemistry of the plants, but we'll move into that a little bit later. But for Vectren Conservation Park, given that wetlands typically are going to be meadow and forest, and a mosaic of those because of flooding and beaver activity and other reasons. Given that VCP was farmed, so there's a lot of abandoned pasture, so meadow-like habitat. And given that wet prairies are a rare habitat in Indiana, but also given that tree species are diversity enhancers, we tried to balance our restoration goals to work both at a wetland prairie habitat, but also to establish more trees. And so I'll try to do this one super briefly, just as an expression of how challenging floodplains are. During the time that we had some small dollars to fund this project, we first targeted Johnson grass and tried to battle Johnson grass. And in the times that we had success knocking Johnson grass down, those would be, of course, the times that we would have floods. And here you can see this representation of 2011. Hey, come on back. Come on forward. Come on forward. Okay, there. You can see this representation in 2011 where we were working hard to put native cane in. So cane is one of these very endangered species, which by itself brings along its own ecosystem. And when we planted the cane out and when we planted a lot of seeds out as well, this is what happened. This is me taking a picture from a canoe in 2011 when the Dean of Arts and Sciences and I took his Kevlar canoe out and paddled 3 miles from the Corps of Engineers levee out to the farmer's levee. The entire property, except for the levees, was under 5 feet of water or more. And it stayed that way for a month. So that's one example of the floods, but those happened multiple years. And in the years that they didn't happen, we also had some wonderful challenges of long periods of drought. But when those things didn't happen and we were able to get out and plant plants, and when we invested in growing saplings for a couple of years and then went out and planted them, then it was the deer who fought us and ate every tree down to the ground. And so after banging our head against the challenging wall of restoration in a floodplain with superabundant numbers of deer, we continued to invest in it. But now our investment is at a scale that can be funded out of my pocket and the gas that's in the vehicle that I drive out with students. And that is, we get out to the field site with students after we collect a few thousand acorns, and we plant those acorns out year after year after year with the hope that we can start to really get a diverse oak set of species out there, with that primary hope that by establishing those species of diversity enhancers, we can really start to move that forest slowly towards a better and better forest that just doesn't have a lot of sycamores that don't support a lot of herbivores. And at the same time, when we're lucky enough to find some good hickories, we bring those out and we use other seeds as well. But because of the challenge and the cost limitations, we're really focusing on a smaller scale at Vectren Conservation Park. And at the same time, while we're doing that, and trying then not to throw away $3,000 worth of purchased seed at a time like those flood years gave us, I was looking at what we have that's native at Vectren Conservation Park, right? 93 native species. And so as a strategy of generating seed that we can then put out to Vectren Conservation Park, that costs $0, but at the effort of harvesting seed, I shifted some of the plants into a native garden at UE where they wouldn't be at risk of being flooded and killed if we planted them. And so now we're sort of shifting from that scale of 1,100 acres to a much more manageable scale. If you think about the UE native plant garden, this is just over 1/10 of an acre, as opposed to 1,100 acres. That is a scale of 1/10,000th the land. A much easier scale to manage. But even at that scale, we are already at a diversity that's greater than the 1,100 acre property. In the same way as I talk about UE's native plant garden, you could be thinking about what can you do in your backyard. Now, 1,100 acres means that it's a much more valuable property for managing flooding, right? Even though it's frustrating, by that land flooding and holding water, you're getting groundwater recharge, you're getting other lands that aren't having that burden of flooding that are occurring. So there are benefits that go with VCP, but one of those challenges of enhancing diversity is much easier to solve at the scale of something roughly the size of your backyard. Imagine being able to outmatch 1,100 acres of diversity by intentionally growing natives and growing a diversity of natives. So that's what I'm going to be exploring and expressing at this second scale. Now, probably like me, you'll have a group of students who come into your backyard and who are just gung-ho about planting it with natives, right? So enjoy that. That is one of the biggest blessings and biggest benefits are people like the four here who were unstoppable. So we had a day where we had, I think, 3 inches of rain, and we were working on the native plant garden. And it was only after 2 hours of them being soaked to the bone that I finally convinced them that they should come in and that you can't really work when you're trying to scoop out 2 inches of water. But the passion that working with native plants can bring is wonderful. And hopefully this can get instilled in your work as you start to work in your own backyard. Now, I also hope that you don't recruit deer to your backyard, but strangely enough, there are enough deer around that this sad, desperate, hungry deer also found UE's native plant garden, at least for one morning. So when I think about what kinds of plants you might be thinking about for your backyard, There are a whole suite of them. And I'm going to do this at the family level. So we'll talk about 4 or 5 families of plants at the beginning here for you to think about what kind of mix you might want. Now for me, because grasses are a fundamental part of a prairie or a meadow, I wanted to make sure that grasses are incorporated. Now grasses typically aren't going to be feeding your eyes with a lot of floral colors, but they too are going to be feeding herbivore species. So many skippers, which are our most diverse group of butterflies, are going to use grasses. And I think of grasses as being wind pollinated, but one of these grasses, the eastern gamma grass, even though it is wind pollinated, is a really great source of pollen for very small bees. You'll see them all over it. But at the same time, I want to tell you that eastern gamma grass is a big bully of a plant that likes to fall over on other plants. So it's not really a lovely display if you don't have a lot of space, and you might get frustrated with it. If you wanted a lovely display, you might think of something delicate like a side oats grama, which is here in this sort of rusty color that you can see at the end of the season. If you want a big boy, maybe you want something like big blue stem or turkey foot that has a lovely rusty color and in the fall and has a bit of showiness to it. Grasses are always going to be that struggle for how much do you want to add to your garden, because they are species that become aggressive and dominant and hold a lot of space. And you have to be willing to be mean to your grasses, willing to cut them back and keep them trained. And I think Shelby probably remembers Howell Wetland and just how aggressive Indian grass can be there. Beautiful plant, but really without the right management, without the right discipline of keeping them from controlling space, they can be problematic. Perhaps the very best plants that you want to think about bringing in would be things in the aster family, the Asteraceae, also known as the sunflower family, also known as the black-eyed Susan family. You can call it whatever you want, but these are really special, highly diverse plants that have several different kinds of flower heads. So they are composed of some ray flowers. So here you can see what you would probably call daisy-like petals, right, that you might pluck off and dream about whether I love you or not. Well, I do, because you're planting these natives in your backyard. Those are actually all flowers. So this plant, this flower right here, is not a flower. That's a flower head composed of tens, if not hundreds, of individual flowers and clusters. And that has led to these plants, this family, being so diverse and so successful. So some of those just might have ray flowers. Some of them might have, disc flowers. Some of them might have heads in the middle that are disc flowers, but also ray flowers. Other ones, like the non-native dandelion, just have the strap or the ray flowers. But here's a list of a few of them. Again, given that there are 80 plus species in this family in the Midwest, you have a lot of choices from that family. The pea family, of course, is another very diverse, very rich, species-rich family. The Fabaceae is so diverse that it even has 3 different kinds of groups. This is sort of the classic group up here. The wild white indigo has this banner up at the top, which is some of the petals, these 2 to the side, and then this fused keel in the middle, which gives you that classic pea-like flower. but there is also this 5-petaled sort of asymmetrical set of flowers. But then there's a third group, the Illinois bundle flower being the example, that's just sort of this wispy set of reduced flowers. But with the Illinois bundle flower, you can see that confirmation of pea nature, which is pea pods, right? So here we have these curved pea pods in the Illinois bundle flower that have actually, you know, I'm not wowed by their flowers in the summer, but those brown, rusty seed pods are really beautiful as you move into the fall. And so here's just a list of some of the things that come in the pea family. The pea family has a lot of chemistry going on in it. And in addition, the pea family also has a mutualistic relationship. And by that, I mean, almost all of the species in the pea family have bacteria that grow in their roots. And those bacteria fix nitrogen and put that into the soil. But really, the peas are doing it because they're getting most of that nitrogen, and then it gets fixed back into the soil. So peas also enhance diversity by creating a more heterogeneous environment with patches of high nutrients, high nitrogen, and other places where they're not occurring, then having lower nitrogen. So a very cool family. The mint family is maybe our best signal of chemistry, right? Because when I say mint, you think, I think I'm going to have a lifesaver that's a mint lifesaver right now, or I think I want to go out to the yard and chew on a piece of mint. All of that is coming from the chemistry used as a way of preventing generalist herbivores from feeding on it. And then we, of course, embrace a lot of the chemicals that we see in the mint family. This is bee balm, and bee balm is also called wild bergamot. And if you're a tea lover, Shelby isn't, by the way, she has a coffee right now, she's not drinking tea. But if you're a tea lover, you might like Earl Grey. Earl Grey's flavor comes from bergamot, and this is the native relative to bergamot. Some of the mints, like the mountain mints, are incredibly fragrant and very minty. Other mints, like bugleweed, don't have that strong minty smell to them. And then bee balm, of course, has its own rich aroma. But there are a large variety of things in the mint family. Most of them, but not all, have these bilaterally symmetrical flowers in them. Others are more open-faced, and that sort of lends itself to different kinds of pollinators. I had to scam in the Campanulaceae because everything I love seems to be coming out of this bellflower family. The bellflowers, like here we see tall bellflower. Tall bellflower is a biennial, but it's just got these glorious, glorious flowers. A very aggressive plant, but so easy to grow. It's just that you have to make sure to have some disturbance around in your yard so it has a place to colonize new seeds, because it's a biennial, right? It takes 2 years and maybe 3, but it flowers and then puts out loads of seed, and it needs a new place to colonize. But it also involves cardinal flower, stunningly beautiful red flowers, and a name that my students took on for an expression without having to swear, and that was great blue lobelia. And so great blue lobelia is an expression of stunningness in itself as well. So the Campanulaceae is a family that's really terrific. And that leads me to really my pet family, the Asclepiadaceae. The Asclepiadaceae, or the milkweed family, is so much my pet family that even though good scientists, systematists, have said that all milkweeds now belong in the dogbane family, I'm totally ignoring that. And you see that I don't put Apocynaceae up here, I put Asclepiadaceae. You can judge me for that. I know I'm, breaking the bounds of what is decent in science, but I just cannot give up my milkweed family. here are 3 examples of the milkweed family. This is the thin leaf milkweed. Has very small, delicate white flowers. These look a whole lot bigger than they really are because I zoomed in on them. The swamp milkweed is probably our best local native milkweed if you're interested in something that grows robustly, flowers profusely, and draws in monarch butterflies. And then this, of course, is the butterfly milkweed, perhaps the most glorious and showy of the milkweeds if you're thinking about growing something in your backyard. So in the same way that trees can be diversity enhancers, you can have herbaceous plants being diversity enhancers too. Notice that the scale steps down a fair amount, right? With the Quercus as a genus, we were talking about 450 species of lepidopterans. Now we're scaling with goldenrods at 100 plus species of herbivores. Now, goldenrods are really perhaps the very best of recruiters of diversity and are also super aggressive plants with a lot of clonality, meaning that they'll send up runners and reproduce without seed. So they will also reproduce by seed, so they're tremendous plants, but stunning fall flowers for the most part. But the aster genus is also a pretty tremendous group of plants for recruiting herbivores. Not to belittle sunflowers, which are also tremendous. And all of these diversity enhancers I've picked turn out to be in the sunflower family, the Asteraceae. So clearly that's not a bad place to start some of the plants you might be thinking about. But I also wanted to mention the milkweeds. Milkweeds sort of typify another perspective, and that is the foundation species idea. Milkweeds, I'm sure you all know, have chemical defenses. They have cardiac glycosides or cardinalides. And because they have those spectacular defenses, you do not ever want to eat them, right? They have chemicals in them that will mess with your heart rate. Now, while that's true for mammals, for insects, it also has a dramatic effect on the potassium, the sodium potassium pump. And so it messes up insects, even though they don't have a mammalian heart. But that chemical defense then lends itself to the evolutionary process of some insects being able to utilize it through natural selection. And so you get this whole group of beetles that have evolved the ability to utilize milkweeds. And so there's this wonderful diverse array of milkweed beetles. And this is Tetraopes tetraophthalmus. I like it because I wear glasses, so I'm a 4-eye. This beetle is called the 4-eyed 4-eye. It's like double picking on this poor guy because his long horns split his eyes so he has 2 above and 2 below. So Tetraopes is a 4-eye. And so if you're somebody who was called 4-eyes as a kid, celebrate it with Tetraopes by growing some common milkweed. There's also 2 species of true bugs. Now I know some of you call every insect a bug, but there's actually an order called the true bugs. And they look pretty much like these guys. Classic looking true bugs. 2 species of milkweed bugs that can utilize the chemical defenses of the plant for itself. Of course, monarch as an adult, and some aphids cranking out their numbers here as well. Here's the monarch as a caterpillar. But you probably notice all of this spectacular coloration, which is the insect co-opting the chemical defense and warning its predators, don't eat me, I'm highly defended, and if you ate me, you're gonna regret it. And so there's a suite of about 20 species that use milkweeds, and you won't find them if you don't have milkweeds, except, you know, some of the pollinators searching out flowers. And so you have these wonderful foundation species with milkweeds. And this is just sort of that emphasis of how chemistry plays into it. This is representing the chemical structure of cardiac glycosides that are found in milkweeds. This is that glorious common milkweed plant. And again, some of the work that these insects are doing to damage it so that they can grow. This is a little baby monarch caterpillar. You can see how it's bitten a few spots where that latex, that milky latex of the milkweed is coming out. Amazingly, even though milkweeds, even though monarchs are adapted to using milkweeds, that first bite that a monarch caterpillar bites into a milkweed is the place of super high mortality. Up to 1/3 of the caterpillars don't survive their first bite because they get glued or they are stunned by the chemical that they ingest and are overloaded with. So that arms race is still happening between milkweeds and their herbivores. But perhaps the coolest story comes out of a research lab in Illinois. May Berenbaum, who is the queen of plant herbivore interactions, has been working, you know, Shelby was giving me a hard time about the 20 years and how, you know, she's barely 20 herself and I've spent that much time here. May Berenbaum makes me look like a spring chicken. She has been doing this monstrously good research on the chemical interactions between plants and their herbivores for, I honestly, I can't tell you how many decades, but it has to be 40 years worth. At least. And so stunningly good research that starts in another family, the Apiaceae, which is the carrot family or the parsley family, or if you like cumin more. Cumin, I think, is a good signal because the chemicals in this family start with coumadins. So that cumin always helps me remember that. Well, those chemicals, there are some that are called furanocoumarins, and that makes me think of fire coumadins. And the linear furanocoumarins basically act as a toxic that kills most generalists that would want to try to eat that plant. And so most insects won't feed in the Apiaceae. But those that have evolved the ability to utilize that chemical usually come with, you know, their own signals of, hey, I'm now utilizing this chemical defense. But then there's this next step in that evolutionary change where those linear furanocoumarins have shifted into angular furanocoumarins. Angular furanocoumarins don't poison the host. Instead, when those chemicals are in contact with light, they burn the host. So if you brush up against giant pigweed and then expose your hand or whatever brushes up against it to the sunlight, you get blistered. That's a tremendously effective, damaging effect if you think about caterpillars, which are these big translucent bags of food on the inside. If sunlight strikes that caterpillar, it basically is lit on fire from the inside and dies. And so the escalation continues. There are parsnip webworms that tie the flower heads in the parsnip family together and hide out inside so that they never get fried during the daylight. They're hidden in there and protected. This wonderful coevolutionary arms race that happens. Oh, and just as a side note, everything that you love as a spice that's not a mint is probably tame versions of things out of this family, right? You can probably think of carrots as, oh yeah, there's some good flavor there, or celery, or cumin, or cilantro, or okay, I'll stop. Anyway, these kinds of chemical defenses have evolved in multiple lineages in many different plant groups. So here we can see, this is the Dutchman's pipe, a local, or I should say a native vine to our area. And it has its own chemical properties that make it toxic to most everything. In fact, those chemicals are so nasty that they cause cancer. And here is the pipe vine swallowtail as a caterpillar, ridiculously cool looking critter. And here's a weathered adult butterfly of the pipe vine swallowtail. And then down in this corner, we see this wonderful mimicry that's happening here where it looks like a green snake on a spice bush plant. So this is the spice bush swallowtail. And then I would ask Shelby, except she's muted, what kind of swallowtail would feed on pawpaw?
You want me to say? A zebra-tailed swallowtail.
Yeah, so it's a zebra swallowtail, and it's not the pawpaw swallowtail, which is, you know, just so sad. But of course, it's a stunning looking zebra-like butterfly. Every swallowtail species needs its host plant. If you don't have pawpaws, you're not going to have zebra swallowtails. If you don't have spice bush, okay, there's a little bit of give there. You might argue for, hey, if you don't have spice bush, perhaps you can get sassafras out there and, you know, feed some of these guys. So there's a little bit of spread, but typically from the same family. If you don't have a pipe vine, or, well, then hopefully you have wild ginger or something else in that same family that could be feeding that swallowtail. But you need that diversity of plants to get the diversity of butterflies. Oh, so this was me. I was going to talk about all the cool things that I've done for research and how that's tied to chemistry and how that leads to foundation species. But this is for just those of you who are over the top. Go out and find my papers. They're accessible on Google Scholar, and you can read about extra chemistry stories in willows or foundation species kinds of arguments in willows. It's the same thing that we talked about before. I'll just say this, that you do, even if you're thinking about what you want in your backyard, want to think about some woody plants, whether they're vines like the pipe vine, or whether they're shrubby trees like willows, or whether you can celebrate because you already have a 90-foot tall oak in your backyard. All of those are contributing to the diversity of insects, which are contributing to the diversity of birds that you might want to recruit. But speaking of that diversity, the thing that you certainly want to do is capture some of that gorgeous floral diversity that's out there. And this is just me throwing a few of the pictures. I'm a terrible photographer. My dream is to maybe become a good photographer and invest a little bit more and pay attention more to the pollinators in the upcoming few years. But what we can see here are some wonderful native bees of different sorts, some wonderful native butterflies of different sorts, and even some beetles that are being recruited to do pollination. And so this is where I'm going to do a terrible job of talking about pollination syndromes. You guys may be familiar with the idea of a syndrome. Let me just say that from the health world, you know, a syndrome means that we don't have a lot of good specifics, but you know, you have these syndromes of health. There are these 5 or 7 kinds of signals that suggest you can group this stuff together. And it's the same here, that there are syndromes. There are these 3 or 5 or 7 things that all sort of fit together in a vague and squishy way, and we don't have really tightness with this, right? But if we were thinking about a bee-pollinated syndrome, I would guess that you're probably seeing some colors like blue and purple, and then, you know, I'm going to lean in and also include yellow because it's a syndrome. It's a little sloppy. that if it's bee pollinated, they cue in on fresh and strong scents. Because it's bee pollinated, they're flying in the day and doing that sun-based temperature regulation and liking it. If it's bee pollinated, it's likely to be bilaterally symmetrical, because bees are sort of the lock and key of the insect world. They have bilateral symmetry that can squeeze into a flower that's bilaterally symmetrical. And I say lock and key. What I really mean is like the lock at my house. That takes about 2 minutes for me to get that darn key all the way in and turned. If you're a plant, you don't want to be a nice smooth lock that the bee can go into. You want it to struggle to push its way in so it gets more pollen on it so it can take it off. So a bad lock and key system, bilateral symmetry for bees. And they're really going both for nectar, but often also for pollen. So that's the bee syndrome. The butterfly syndrome is bright flowers, sometimes red, I would say, often yellow. Butterflies don't really have good olfactory cues, and so it's not strong signals typically. Day flying for most butterflies, but needing a landing platform. They're not going to have that lock and key thing because they have these big old wings that are there to show off and get dates. And so for the most part, they're nectar only and aren't using the pollen. So the pollen is sort of accidental carry in that mutualistic relationship. So if we were to distinguish these two, right, bees typically more bilateral, butterflies more of a landing platform, bees more with pollen, butterflies mostly just with the nectar. Colors have a fair amount of overlap. Now let's shift to one that has a much stronger kind of contrast, moth pollinated. And by moth pollinated, really what I'm saying are hawk moths. Spectacularly good nighttime or dusk pollinators. They do have a good sense of smell, sweet and strong. The flower color is typically white or yellow so that it can be seen at dusk or maybe by moonlight. So there's a lot of reflective ability of those flowers for the moth to be able to find it. Usually very large flowers relative to some of the other scales, usually with deep spurs so that those hawk moths with their very long tongues are the only thing that can get the nectar, but have to go close enough to the flower to pick up the pollen. And while the moth is only going for the nectar, that the pollen is the being moved is the benefit for the plant. So I like to think of, you know, this is the nighttime flyer, but that's because we don't do much with bats around here. There aren't many bat pollinated plants where we're at, so I'll skip over those guys. And then flies are a lovely contrast to everything up there, because some of those flies, like for the pipevine, is often fly pollinated, or little midges that are recruited to funky smells, or skunk cabbage perhaps might be one that you first think of if you've ever experienced it. There's a reason it's called skunk cabbage. Things that have a stink to them, right? A rotting smell. So this is just a trick to recruit flies who think, oh, there's a dead carcass here. That might make it sound less attractive for you to put in your backyard, huh? So we'll just stop with that one. But that's sort of a different syndrome. And then there's this other kind of fly that's a day flying fly that looks for light colors with faint smell and might eat some of the pollen, but also would drink some of the nectar, but that are sort of open flowers. Notice that flies that are getting a reward are probably on a lot of the same sorts of things that butterflies that are getting a reward. And I wouldn't be surprised to see a fly getting a reward on the same plant that a butterfly is. And the bee's not going to go, oh, you know what? I don't think I'm going to go to that one. It doesn't fit the syndrome for me, right? And that's what I mean by that messiness. You're going to get a lot of overlap because each individual is trying to make the living of getting the resources they need to live and survive. And so it's a bit messy. Yeah, and then beetles can be an interesting one as well. But we'll say we're done with that. Oh, you know what? But I'll come back to this. So here is in the middle where it belongs as a central point, a milkweed. This is, again, the butterfly milkweed, which butterflies love. Here's a milkweed up here, which is the swamp milkweed with a monarch hanging out on it, drinking nectar. You could still get a butterfly or a bee drinking nectar on it. Oftentimes, these beetles will be using the milkweed. Here we see a bilaterally symmetrical flower in the bee balm and a bee, not surprisingly, on it. But it's not like these aren't going to be used by everybody. All pollinators have a degree of opportunistic nature to them, right? If they can get nectar in a spot, they're going to. And there are rare exceptions to even that. There are some very specific plants that have very specific pollinators. So spring beauty has a bee species that's very specialized to it. The hibiscus plants that are native to this area have very specialized bees that will use them. And yet there'll also be generalists that run all over the place. Okay, so that's my short story on pollination syndromes. But that also lends to itself a place to think about magnet species. Basically these diversity enhancers that are centered on being recruiters for pollinators. So my favorite, of course, is another milkweed. This is common milkweed with this beautiful umbel of flowers. When milkweed is in flower, up to 35% of all of the moisture it's losing is through the nectar that it's producing. You know, half of its resources are being flooded out through this nectar that everything is coming and utilizing on those giant balls of flowers. It is recruiting tremendous numbers of pollinators. And then those pollinators could spill over to other plants that aren't recruiting as many. So these are sort of like nectar recruiters, pollinator recruiters. Bee balm is definitely one of those that brings in many species of pollinators. But so are goldenrods, buttonbush. A short aside, 1 year, you know, I told you all about how rough the flooding is at VCP. Well, 1 year after about 2 months of drought, nothing but brown, crispy world when we were hiking out in the fall, except in these seasonal ponds that had just started to lose the last of their water. And those ponds are a place that buttonbushes love because they like to have their feet wet. Those buttonbushes were flowering and recruiting everything that was around, right? Anything that needed a nectar resource were on these buttonbushes. So buttonbush is also a gold mine for recruiting pollinators. So a small woody shrub that you might want to think about. Wild senna is spectacular for bees. Mountain mint can recruit across that range of flies, which you might expect from the color of that, but also, of course, bees and also butterflies because it's sort of an open platform. So many different species to think about for really pulling in a lot of species at one time. Okay. I think we've sort of led pretty clearly into what you might want to do in your backyard. I would encourage you to be thinking native because, one, if you're using natives, you're supporting nearly 30 times the diversity of animals than you would with ornamentals, right? So even native, even natives that are horticultural sometimes undercut that support. You know, if you get these flowers that don't produce nectar, that don't produce pollen, because there are these tight clusters that don't provide access to them, those aren't good either. So the more native that you can go, the more insect and bird diversity you're going to be able to support. In addition, non-natives are going to lend themselves to be runaway non-natives where they become invasive in a system. And then finally, if we think about lawns, you know, I have to say I've been trained in that good Norwegian mindset growing up in Northwest Iowa, that a nice, clean, orderly lawn is necessary in the same way that I must keep my meat from my potatoes, from my carrots. Everything in its own place. And lawn should only be this one species of non-native grass, and we should chemically eliminate everything else. In other words, we should make a bright green desert that is no place for any other plant nor for animals. So instead, and first I should say, if you're looking from the horticultural burden, here are plants that people might think, ooh, I love that. I remember going to New York State and going, what's that really pretty purple flower that surrounds this lake? And my colleague said, oh, do you mean purple loosestrife, that invasive plant from Europe? And I said, no, I was thinking of something else. So, right, if we bring these lovely flowers in from Europe and they escape and they become this harmful, aggressive in our wetlands, or we go, oh, here's a honeysuckle, I'll grow that. And then birds disperse it and it invades our woodland edges. Or if we, you know, grow multiflora rose, again, Shelby can probably tell you more about how fun it is to deal with the consequences of that species being brought in. Okay, instead, native plants don't have this burden. Native plants, compared to a sad green lawn desert, bring in tremendous diversity. And some of the things you can think about as you're choosing what native plants. Do you want some all-stars that are super aggressive? I do here in UE's native plant garden, but here I am at 6'4". Here is cup plant, the all-star Silphium species for Southwest Indiana. What a stunner this plant is. But I can tell you, I carve out 30 to 50 of these plants every year because it is so aggressive that it would own this entire native plant garden, right? You have to be willing to control aggressive plants. In the same way, goldenrod, one of those diversity enhancers, and magnet species, is really aggressive and grows clonally and spreads out. So while it's a star for both beauty and for recruiting diversity, it is very aggressive. Here we have ironweed, which, you know, it's only 8.5 feet tall. It's not 9 feet tall. Kidding. So it's also a plant that will cover a lot of space. Wild senna gets big, but heck, it's only 6 foot tall, so a little bit more mild. But with it comes its own set of beautiful butterflies that you're not going to recruit if you don't have it or partridge pea, the one annual that I'm showing you in this entire talk. And so I made this second slide of, okay, here are some little bit more tame species. And then I thought about it and I realized I'm actually lying. This is New England aster, which is a beautiful, beautiful flower, sort of late summer into the fall. But while it's beautiful, and so is this black-eyed Susan, and there are several species of black-eyed Susan or brown-eyed Susans or whatever you'd like to call them that occur. And literally 2 weeks ago, when I had to take a break and I was walking out in the native plant garden, both of these still had a few plants flowering, still flowering. So, you know, you get this super long window of flowering times with these, but they are aggressive and they do spread tremendously. This one, I would say, is a much more fairly, reasonably tame species. The blazing stars usually don't spread quite as aggressively as the asters and the rudbeckias. But I will say, any native that you think of is going to do well in time. So you do have to be willing to keep digging them up, keep managing them so that you regulate what you have. Like this is American Columbine, stunning spring flower, reasonably well behaved, but if you have open soil, it's producing seed and it will establish in those places. This is one of the evening primroses. This is one of the more tame ones, but it again will spread and cover areas. But all of these are at least, you know, only 2 foot tall or maybe 3 foot tall. Here's Rattlesnake Master, which does a lovely job of recruiting during its season. But depending on what kind of gardener you want to be, these could be pretty reasonable ones. But as you go native, you have to have a bit of a mindset of, I'm okay with a rambunctious garden. You know, a little bit of bolsteriness, a little bit of pushing into the trail is what you get with a lot of species. These would be the exceptions, right? These are sort of the shade-tolerant native species, ones that are less risky from the sense of aggressiveness than the ones that I've been showing you, because they're used to being challenged by being shaded by canopy and sub-canopy trees. And so geraniums are beautiful spring flowers. They don't spread too rapidly in the same way phlox. Mertensia, bluebells are good that way. And so you could be thinking about understory species, but in some ways then these are more work, right? Because you need to tend them better. The more aggressive it is, the less you have to attend them for their success, but the more you have to attend them so that they don't own your entire world. Okay, but as you do that, recognize that you're enhancing diversity as you add more and more and more. The plants are feeding the insects. Those insects, those herbivores, are feeding other insect predators. Those plants could also be feeding bird, basically giving you bird seed. The compass plants are amazing for goldfinches. I have at least a half a dozen goldfinches that cruise through the native plant garden, even though it's this little postage stamp in the middle of the campus, because there's so much food resource in this natural setting for them. And so birds are recruited to the food or to the habitat, or of course, to the insects that they're feeding on as well. So as you bring more into your native plant garden, your own personal backyard garden, you're bringing in all of this wonderful diversity as well. So I have been trained, as Shelby said, for longer than she's been alive, by a very long shot, in ideas of conservation biology and diversity, and of course, evolutionary ecology. But what's really cool about starting to own your own native plant garden is that you are becoming a citizen scientist. You are becoming a naturalist. You are becoming an ecologist. And so all of these ideas are things that you can grow into and enjoy and mature in as well. Someday, you'll be as old as Shelby. And at that point, you'll know as much as Shelby, right? And won't that be so cool? Never will you be as old as I am. And I know a couple of my friends out there that might watch this will be like, youngster. So one of the ways that you can go about it is starting to gain that knowledge about plant identification and knowing the different species, and insect identification and knowing the different insects, and starting to embrace that. You know, the truth is that naturalists, which is the foundation to ecology, naturalists don't have to be professionals. You don't have to get a PhD in evolutionary ecology. You can start investing, right? Just in what you love, whether it's plants or butterflies or bees or flies. That one seems strange to me. But they're cool. I have this wonderful book on my shelf that has these amazing illustrations of the diversity of flies. And as you do that, and as you grow in that love, you can also be growing as a restoration ecologist in your own backyard. The reality is, if we think about all of these desert lawns that we have, and all of these places that could be these problems for invasive species that spread out, if we turn it on its head and we start investing in the natives, you could have more natives in your backyard than we have in 1,100 acres out at Vectren Conservation Park. If we all start to buy into this mindset, as Doug Ptolemy talks about, we have more land than all of the national parks in the United States in suburban landscapes. If we can convert that all into natives, we are doing more for the environment than you could imagine. That's like having an entire set of national parks again, feeding wildlife, starting with protecting those plants, and then feeding those herbivores, and then feeding the birds or the insect predators of those plants. How could we not want to do that? A classic book, historically, is Go Native. I remember reading this book and just being so inspired by her perspective. She starts off the book with this idea of my sibling was planting these pretty flowers, and I was taking plants from the forest and putting them at the edge in my own garden because my grandma let me have this patch. And then she comes back to that patch decades later, and of course her sister's stuff is all gone, but her area has become this gorgeous understory landscape of native plants. How can you not want to do that? Doug Tallamy's book, Bringing Nature Home, has been one of those books that's helped to transform the mindset of so many people in the US. And it talks about these diversity enhancers, both the herbaceous ones and the woody ones. And it gives a wonderful frame of reference and a really great read. The Midwestern Native Garden gives you a way to think about, okay, this is the plant that I have that's a non-native. What would be a good plant that's a native that's either related to it or that has the same kind of form? If you're more interested in sort of an intermediate level and growing that knowledge, Kay Yaskevich's book, Indiana Wildflowers. Yeah, I'm gonna just pull that one over here. So Kay's book, that looks like this. Okay, where am I? Okay, never mind. Kay's book is phenomenal. It has all of the different species of flowers that you might come across, and that gives you a great way of thinking about it. My favorite new book, and by new, you know, this, remember, I've been doing this for 20 years just in Evansville. My favorite new book is The Butterflies of Indiana. I love this book because for every butterfly species, he'll list what plant species are host to it. In other words, you need this plant to feed this butterfly. And so if you're really interested from the butterfly perspective and you're just doing plants as a way to get there, that's the book you want to think about. And then Mike Hamoya's book, that's about forests and the plants that you see there, also has a lot of that lovely natural history in it. And then when you get to the place where you just want to step to that next level on plants, look to Flora of Indiana. One of the Indiana groups actually has made this a digital form so that you can download this entire tome and have it in a digital format. And the neat thing about it, again, as I mentioned long ago, 7 hours ago when I started this talk, that book has a county by county map that shows which plant species are found where. And so that's a really great way to confirm what would be appropriate in your backyard. I added this slide because I thought maybe some of you are like me and you spend too much time on the web. Well, if you do that, make it productive time. Think about looking at the Indiana Native Plant Society, who has their website, who also has a Facebook group. I love that group. There are some exceptional people in it, and they will, you'll see posts of what's flowering at a given time, and people who have questions about it, they often identify those plants. It's a way of growing and learning from an online venue. The Xerxes Society has been around for even longer than me, and they've been doing invertebrate conservation for a very long time. They've been promoting things like Leave the Leaves and other strategies to help enhance insect diversity. Also, Facebook groups, Butterflies of Indiana is a lovely one if you're more into the butterflies. All bugs go to Kevin. That's Kevin Weiner, who has, I don't know, a year or 2 years ago, launched his own site. And you get to see this wonderful display of photographs that people have in Indiana, but actually all around the world now. And so you can learn more about what species you're seeing at a given season. Indiana wildlife, perhaps, at a broader level. Oh, I did want to say, become that awesome naturalist. You might, as you think about who are amazing naturalists here in Southwest Indiana, they aren't necessarily professionally trained, but they're phenomenal. They're so good. That person can be you, whether it's for plants or for insects or for birds. There are some people who are so much better than I am that haven't had, that soul withering, back-breaking 6 to 8 years of graduate research to get published and to move along. But their skills are phenomenal, right? I mean, Kevin, as just one example, what a photographer, what great insects are there. And I would do shout outs to others, but I'll leave that for Shelby because I'm running out of my 3 hours of time. And at that point, Shelby, do you have any questions for me other than to ask me what this plant and butterfly is? I bet you know what this plant is.
Oh, isn't it passion flower?
Did everyone else out there notice that she finally read the top and was like, oh, isn't that passion flower? Is that what you did?
Oh my gosh, I didn't even read that.
Well, can you tell me, what is the butterfly?
I'm gonna guess it's the Gulf fritillary.
The fritillary, but it is the toughest butterfly name to say, isn't it?
I've typed it out
So
like
many
6
times.
times today. I was making lists for hosts, and I still can't spell it
Yeah,
right.
and I have, yeah, it's a hard one. But yeah, there are some beautiful butterflies in Indiana. And this one just squeaks in. And the only reason it gets into the southern part of Indiana is because we have passion flowers that make it up here, right? We have all these lovely tropical plants that just barely get into Indiana. And the purple passion flower is one of those. So did you have any other questions, Shelby?
I do have questions, and I'll write them in the chat too. So we have them kind of on record, or at least general contact information. First, did you know about like the flooding issues for the Vectren Conservation Park? Is that part of why they got rid of the land?
You know, there's such a wonderful history with that area that at one point, you know, there were like 13 families in that flood area in the early to mid 1800s. There was a schoolhouse in that property that got flooded back in that day. So, I mean, there's this history of knowledge about flooding, but we've done these dramatic landscape changes, right? And as you've cut more forest further north, those flooding incidences become worse and worse. So that in a 5-year period, we had 2 50-year floods. Now, hopefully you understand a 50-year flood, that should happen about, oh, I don't know, every 50 years or so. But because of the way we've changed the landscape, floods along rivers are more severe and more serious. Part of that has to do with cutting forests. Part of that has to do with levees being built, which just forces the water further south. But so yes, flooding I totally got, but until I canoed the property under 5 feet of water, I just was not aware of how severe it would be. And until we had multiple years of drought, that contrast challenge makes it really difficult to do any meaningful, rapid restoration at the site. And so long-term strategies for very low dollars is really about all that I have left as a strategy, because the dollars just aren't there to support the work.
Sure. As far as the Paul Rothrick's like ranking list of plant quality, is that something others could access, and how?
Yeah, so he published that. And
Okay.
so it is a paper that is available. I don't know that I put it on the list of information. I did not. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Maybe
But,
I could, you could send it
but
to me.
they could contact you for it,
Sure.
and you could share it.
Yeah.
If you can't pull it up from Google Scholar, I will send it to you.
Perfect.
Because you're the best contact, right? I mean, I'm okay with them contacting me, but I get these weird signals that this is outside of UE, and so I might not know that it's somebody who's legitimate.
That's fair. That's very fair.
But
Yeah,
people are welcome to try me.
sure, sure. Let's see what else I wrote down. I made a quick note of it for those that are in this workshop. If you recall, when Megan Redderskamp spoke about the percentage of non-natives to natives, it actually checked out with the percentage that you had in Vectren Conservation Park. And it's just so cool to see how consistent that is, that even only with having a quarter of them non-native, it still caused a quality level of 2. So I just wanted to remind everybody and myself that just because it seems like such a small percentage, it has detrimental results.
Right. And just to reiterate that in a different way, so that really is a value that's an average across the whole 130 plant species. But the other quality has to do with if you just sample a plot in the field, if 2/3 of your plants are Johnson grass, you know, it makes it even more problematic.
Yeah.
And each non-native that is an aggressive, invasive, makes it that much worse. And clearly, intact, undestroyed habitat is the most important thing. right? Like Wesselman Woods is this treasure because it's intact. And so, you know, you might think about, oh, but the multiflora rose is getting in. But in the healthy part of that forest, it doesn't get in, right? And it's also this treasure trove of genetic diversity, right? So it hasn't lost the diversity of individuals for the ashes or for the oak species or whichever one you might want to think about. Whereas doing restoration, you know, there are all these layers of challenge, including what kind of genetic diversity you're getting as you're doing that restoration work.
Yeah, yeah. Let's see what else I wrote down. I had all these good questions. I don't know if they're good or not. So I wondered if you could touch a little bit more on grasses as far as benefits for your average homeowner. What are some reasons that they should plant a few native grasses?
Well, it really depends on what you want. The reason I like the grasses is because they do a great job of feeding the birds, right? If you think about those seed heads, those are going to pull in a lot of birds for that resource. In addition, if you like a fall and winter visual, you know, like in my background here, I have the native plant garden in all of the glory of summer with all of the yellow and purple and pink flowers that are out. But in the fall, all of those flowers are gone away. And so you can get some beautiful landscape look with some of those grasses still staying there. Like the big blue stem is this gorgeous brown to rusty color that stays around through the winter time. It also provides cover for insects as well as vertebrates. So there are those values as well. And depending on what your aesthetic is, you know, you probably want to have a combination of flowers and grasses to have different kinds of lines and visuals.
Sure. And it just adds to the diversity of it too.
Absolutely. Well, it does. It contributes to all that skipper diversity. There are dozens of skipper species, and so many of them make their living on feeding on grasses.
Mm-hmm.
One experiment that I was doing on Johnson grass was in our old greenhouse, and those doggone skippers flew in through the openings and laid eggs and were feeding on the grasses in there. I mean, they will find your grasses if you have them in your backyard.
Wow. Wow. They're adamant little things.
Yeah.
All right, let's see what else I got here. Pawpaws. They're like a darker purple flower. What pollinates them?
That's a terrific question. Back in the day when I was in Missouri, this is before you were born. Back in the day when I was in Missouri, one of the students was graduate students was looking at that. And it's not too surprising that there are beetles that pollinate the pawpaw. They're very robust flowers, very durable flowers. I wouldn't be surprised if you found some midges or other kinds of fly species that also get in there. You know, that color is a classic signal for something that would be fly pollinated. But I think it's primarily some beetles that do the work.
Okay. All right. And that is all the questions I had. There were a few points just for conclusiveness, unless you had anything else, Cris.
Oh my goodness, after however many hours we've been at this,
You're
I
fine.
am all done. But what a treat. It was so fun to get to talk with you, Shelby, because last time we did this, I somehow lost having you in the box to the side. So it's nice to have you there to talk with you.
Yes. I still, every time, like, I mean, I listened to this like almost a week ago and I still got something different every single time. I think the moral of the story is everyone's going to take away, how old is Shelby? Is she 12? Is that what's happening here?
Oh, get out of here. Shelby is 15 years old. She
Strong.
just had her birthday. We're very excited for her.
Oh, so the last point I did want to make, I might forward it out to the registrants, is a video by Doug Tallamy, kind of talking about it. It really almost bookends what Cris and Megan have talked about in the importance of native species and their relationships. One of the things he mentioned at the end of it was an analogy with statues and how invasive species are kind of like the statues. And a lot of people say, well, I love some of my cultivars, why do I have to get rid of them? And he said, it's not bad to have a statue, because that's essentially the ecological value and function that they bring. So it's not bad to have those. It's just bad whenever you have an entire lawn of just statues. First it's going to look weird and just not producing anything
Right.
important. So I wanted to make that point.
And just to encourage those who struggle with that, if you want to start with a few species. Plug in a dozen milkweed plants and recruit for the monarch butterfly, or pick the pawpaw and recruit for the zebra swallowtail, or find a corner to start your natives in and see what you think of it. Do a combination of some of those lovely understory flowers below the fruit tree that you're harvesting from. I think it's great to have some non-native fruit trees, because that's a different side of the ecology that you're benefiting. If you're not hauling in your cherries from some other state, but you're growing them in your backyard, you're really helping out with an ecological footprint in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, do a small start, if not a big one.
Yeah. I hope people don't feel too overwhelmed with what to plant, because I definitely thought that when, trying to find my own plants. Start small, and do know that our SWCDs for your county, we offer free site visits, free technical assistance, and we'll come to your house. We'll take a look at whatever you want, listen to your goals, dreams, whatever you want to share with us that day. We will listen. We're part-time therapists, really.
Yeah.
But mostly we are there to help suggest what kind of ecological benefits that you want to get for your lawn, whether it's aesthetic, or maybe it's to get a certain animal, maybe it's function, as this area is flooding too much, what do I do? Whatever it might be, we're here to help make suggestions. So feel free to reach out to us. You can call our office or email us. Check out our website for any other details. But we are here to help. And again, thank you so much, Cris, for your information. We've got one more workshop next week with Samantha Dame, and she'll go over some planting strategies and maintenance to kind of be the bookend for this workshop. So
thank you so much for having me, Shelby. It is so great to hear you, especially here at the end, and highlighting what you all do. You guys really are a treat, and it's been fun getting to do this again.
It has been fun. All right, I'm going to sign off on the recording here.